Welcome to the Muscle Expert Podcast with Ben Pakulski, one of the world's top professional bodybuilders, an expert on human performance and mindset mastery. Ben dives deep to deliver the strategies of the top experts to upgrade your body, mind, muscle, strength, performance, biochemistry, and how to become the upgraded modern man.
All right, ladies and gents, welcome back. Muscle Expert Podcast. If you like to sleep or if you like to build muscle or live an amazing life, you're going to want to pay attention to this podcast. Dan Pardi joins us once again to give us the sleep deep dive. And this was definitely just that, the deep dive. Literally everything you want to know about sleep is contained here in this podcast. I probably have about 7 pages of notes on everything we talked about that is going to directly impact your understanding of sleep. And obviously, as always, the applicable golden nuggets that you can take right now and apply to your life to improve your deep sleep, your REM sleep, your understanding of sleep, and some other very, very interesting implications around how we can impact sleep and how sleep is impacting us. So we get into some things like GHB, which is a sleep medication that I do not condone or endorse, but Dan Pardi is the world's leading authority on research of it and how it works and why it's helping so many people with narcolepsy. Super interesting getting into something called pink noise. We've all heard of white noise, which is the background ambient noise, but pink noise is something that he says is now proven to improve our deep sleep and how it works. We get into the impact of light. We get into the stages of sleep, understanding how they're impacting your quality of sleep. We talk a lot about deep sleep, and for most of us, deep sleep is the ever elusive ideal end result. And a lot of us are lacking deep sleep. And Dan and I talk about a lot of ways how you can hack your deep sleep. We also talk about the balance of sleep. So many people are, taking one product to try to improve deep sleep, or maybe they're trying to improve REM sleep, but it's actually in some way negatively impacting some other aspect of sleep. And we always negate or neglect the benefit of light sleep, or maybe the wakeful aspects of sleep. And those things are just as important as every aspect of sleep. And as Dan will explain in the podcast, it's not something you ever want to neglect. We talk a little bit about sleep drugs, sleep supplements, really everything you want to know about sleep is included somewhere in this podcast. So huge shout out and thank you to Dan Pardi of Human OS for joining me today and enlightening us on all the incredible implications of sleep, how it works, how it's impacting your brain, how it's impacting decision-making, how it's impacting your ability to grow and recover, how it's impacting your ability to burn fat, your ability to perform. So many things are massively impacting our ability to live our greatest life. And this podcast is always framed around building your greatest body, living your greatest life. And this podcast is going to contribute to that greatly. So I hope you guys enjoy the podcast with Dan Pardi. And as always, if you've enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe to the podcast and leave us a review if it's something you want to hear more of, or if there's anything that we missed or any questions you have, hit me up and I will do my best to answer those questions. Enjoy the show with Dan Pardi. I know we talked about this a little bit last time, but I'd love to learn about kind of the pharmacokinetics of GHB, like what actually is happening and how is it so different than the other products?
Yeah, so most other, not all, but most sedative hypnotics like Ambien, Zopiclone, Sonata, these things are considered non-benzodiazepine-like drugs. So what that means is that they really are working similar to benzodiazepines, which were first sedative hypnotics. So these are things like Xanax, other types of GABA-related compounds. Now, the new class of those, the non-benzodiazepines, also work at GABA receptors to facilitate chloride conductance, which then causes clinically a improvement in sleep latency and then better sleep maintenance. So somebody can fall asleep faster and they can stay asleep longer. The problem is that they are not good chronic medications because meaning that you take them regularly for a long time. Because even though they're helping you get back to sleep, for some people, they're actually promoting a type of sleep that is problematic because it doesn't allow you to get in all the sleep stages necessary. It suppresses some stages at the expense of helping you fall asleep. And if you're needing to fall asleep temporarily, if you have an acute sleep issue, they're good. They have real utility. But the problem is that people become dependent on them, and that has shown to be associate with a really significant increase in Alzheimer's disease. And so,
what stage is it suppressing?
It's suppressing the deeper stage, non-REM, slow wave sleep. And so what's so different about GHB is that it does not affect GABA A receptors, but it has, parsing this over the last 50 years has been really hard. And there are actually GHB receptors that are, we call them binding sites because we're uncertain if they actually act as receptors. But there is evidence that they do. So if you'll see the clustering of GHB, which by the way is produced in every cell in our body, and you'll see those located in synaptosomal fractions. So you seem to see a higher concentration in the synapse. We have identified these binding sites that are G protein coupled, which then the GHB will bind to. Whether or not that's having any important clinical effect when you take GHB pharmacologically, it's unknown and it's unlikely, but there could be some modulation effects that are taking place from GHB binding at GHB binding sites. The majority of the benefit, however, comes from GHB binding at GABA B receptors, and that is where that's why it's so different than GABA A. It's just a whole different type of receptor, and the clinical effect is that you see very robust slow wave sleep occur in response to GHB, and that is what's missing, and that's really that most restorative phase of sleep, and happy to explain why.
Oh, I'd love to hear it. Please do.
Yeah, so if you think about anabolic and catabolic processes, which I know you know about very well, essentially catabolism is the breaking down of substances, mostly for energy purposes, and anabolic processes are the building up of more complex molecules. So in a sleep state, or when you're awake, I should say, when you're awake or you're sleep deprived, you end up having an alteration of AMP to ATP ratios, higher AMP to ATP ratios. And what that leads to is the phosphorylation of AMP kinase, which then contributes directly to catabolic processes. Conversely, when you get into deep slow wave sleep, you see a lower AMP to ATP ratio, decreases in phosphorylation of AMP kinase, and then you see the buildup of things like proteins and glycogen and even fatty acid complexes. And so it's only during that stage where you have a lot of restoration in the brain and the body. And over time, that's exactly what the result of getting an adequate amount of that stage of sleep is you notice in really significant performance improvements. So how well you're thinking, how well your brain and body are working, essentially. So that's why getting that stage of sleep is critical. Sadly, as we age, when we're 60, on average, you're getting 15% of the slow wave sleep that you were when you were a young adult. And then eventually, when you're missing nearly all of it, you're not also purging certain neurotoxic substances. That stage of sleep also happens to be the time when you are purging a lot of these potentially deleterious byproducts of energy usage, things like beta amyloid, et cetera. And so during slow wave sleep, there is this increase in the space between your interstitium, which allows for beta amyloid, which aggregates in Alzheimer's disease, to get into the cerebrospinal fluid, and then it gets purged. And if you don't get that stage of sleep, it's not getting purged. And unfortunately, it's this vicious cycle. So the less that you get slow wave sleep, the more that beta amyloid aggregates and accumulates in an area called the medial prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for the generation of slow wave sleep. And the more beta amyloid you have there, the less likely you are to actually be able to get rid of it. So it's this vicious cycle like we see in physiology. So it's figuring out ways to get more slow wave sleep will prevent its own decay and could potentially even rescue people that have built up a significant amount of amyloid and aren't getting enough slow wave sleep. So that's why GHB is so important.
So most of your research then is done in elderly populations who are lacking sleep, or is it done in anyone who's lacking this delta wave sleep? Well, slow wave sleep?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, certainly the clinical utility of GHB in populations that are not getting adequate slow wave sleep is clear. All those areas should be tested. We were looking, however, mostly in narcolepsy. narcoleptics are missing a protein in their brain called hypocretin, also called orexin, because two different labs discovered at the same time. So permanently from now on in the literature, you're going to see, orexin / hypocretin, same thing though. And these neurons are very interesting. They are exclusively located in the parafornical region of the brain, which is a part of the hypothalamus. And they are essentially the seat of the wake network. So they spread to all different parts of the brain. And they tell the wake network, which is comprised of serotonergic neurons, histamatergic neurons or histamine-related neurons, norepinephrine-related neurons, and then locus coeruleus, etc. They tell all of those neurons when to be on during the day, and they get them to play. And when narcoleptics are missing that symphony conductor, if you will, then we have a very difficult, those people who are afflicted with this condition have a very difficult time maintaining high levels of alertness. And so you can only be up for a few hours at a time, and then enough sleep pressure builds up and they'll fall asleep. So narcoleptics sleep more like a cat. So they're up for a few hours and they have to sleep for a few hours. They're up for a few hours, then they have to sleep. People that don't have narcolepsy can consolidate their wakefulness across 16 hours, and then they can consolidate their sleep across 8. And so that allows for a more normal sleep-wake pattern that humans rely on to function in the world. And so what GHB does in this population, it does a variety of things, but it helps them get deeper sleep and longer sleep. But they have to still wake up in the middle of the night, take a second dose, and then go back to sleep. But it allows them to have better wakefulness during the day and better sleep at night.
Is that a predominantly genetic scenario, or what are the causes of narcolepsy in your experience?
It has been really difficult to pin that down over time. And the thinking is that it's an autoimmune disorder, but it's been hard to find the smoking gun, because an autoimmune attack will occur and then the evidence for it might disappear. And so usually the onset of diagnosis for somebody with narcolepsy can take over a decade. So they're dealing with these symptoms and they don't really know why. And part of that has to do with not having, enough understanding across society, including doctors, to be able to identify narcolepsy appropriately. That's changing. That's improved. That typically happens when you see a drug approved for a condition. The company does a marketing campaign that tries to increase awareness about the disorder itself so that people that might be dealing with those symptoms can go get tested. And sometimes that's looked down upon as like, this medical advertising is, they shouldn't be selling drugs. That's true, I think, in a lot of senses. But in some ways, by increasing awareness of a condition, that can help more people get diagnosed that are otherwise dealing with this condition and then suffer. So that can happen really in any decade of life. I wonder if the rate of narcolepsy will increase as we are seeing an increase in autoimmunity and autoimmune-related disorders in the world. And I don't actually have information about if that's true or not at the moment, but you do see differences in narcolepsy across the world. So highest rate is in Japan, lowest rate is in Israel. In the United States, it's about 1 in 2,000 people that have that disorder. And they'll typically go on modafinil or amphetamines, and those help to improve the condition. But GHB, or sodium oxybate, as it's called in the clinical setting, has the greatest effect in improving symptoms of the condition.
Super interesting. So I'm guessing a lot of my demographic doesn't have narcolepsy, but a lot of them may be lacking in slow sleep, the slow wave sleep.
Yeah.
What are some of the causes in your experience of people lacking this slow wave sleep?
Yeah. So, typically, if you think about the mechanics of slow wave sleep in general, then it has a lot to do with energy usage across the brain. And that the typical homeostatic process to control the amount of slow wave sleep that a normal person gets has everything to do with energy usage. And so there's something called process S, or the sleep process, and this has to do with a model that was proposed by Alexander Borbet in 1980, which then led to essentially it changed the sleep field, because this model that he proposed is that sleep and wake are controlled by two interacting processes. Process S, which is this buildup of sleep pressure, and then process C, which is wake drive or circadian processes. And so when you wake up at 7 a.m. in the morning and you're awake all the way until, let's say, 10 o'clock at night, you don't necessarily feel sleepier across the day. You have ultradian variation in your alertness, so you might feel sleepier in the afternoon. Many people do. But generally you have good days and bad days. And the reason for that is, even though this process of sleep pressure is building up as you're awake and brain is thinking and high energy usage, that is being counteracted by an also increasing drive for wakefulness in that wake network that I just mentioned. So your experience is that your wakefulness is fairly stable, but kind of for different reasons across the day. I mean, it's, you have a very high sleep pressure at 7 p.m. at night, but you're meeting it with a very high wake drive. And so you actually tend to perform fine. But anyway, you are burning a lot of energy over that day. And what ends up happening is that this propensity for slow wave activity, this deep, rhythmic, high amplitude slow waves, is being promoted by high energy consumption. And so if you have greater mental energy consumption, that's a way to deepen sleep. So if you're thinking really hard, if you do reading, anything that's going to challenge the brain, even physical activity, will actually promote a depth of slow wave sleep. And what happens is that you have this currency is being measured this currency of energy usage is being measured by neurons, and that currency is adenosine. So if you think adenosine triphosphate, which is what we use for energy, as energy is being utilized, adenosine accumulates, and neurons are sensing that. And what ends up triggering is a increase in immune molecules, so interleukin 6 and TNF alpha. And those then are directly involved in both the synthesis or the generation of slow wave sleep, and also in what are called neuroplastic processes, allowing neurons to connect, disconnect, and reconnect with other neurons, so that you can essentially change your brain in response to the stimulation that came in during the day. And so it's, these are very old processes that have been involved that have been around for millions of years. They're manifest in the human brain, and they sort of explain why we are able to learn new things. So the memory is intimately tied with this energy usage, and then sleep essentially allows for a stable platform for new neurons to reconnect. So you wake up the next day, hopefully a little smarter than you were the day before, and better able to adapt to whatever the current circumstances are. Think about the alternative of that is that if you were to wake up in the morning, if you were to wake up every day but you couldn't learn, you essentially would only be traversing the world with pre-programmed instincts from your ancestors, and that wouldn't enable you to survive with peak efficiency in this world. So that's one of the advantages that humans have, is that we have this ability to then learn and create neuroplastic processes that help us pick up information, help us pick up new skills, and be hopefully smarter as we age.
Incredible, man. So obviously someone then who has lower deep sleep is going to have decreased memory consolidation overnight. So this is a big concern for a lot of people.
Yeah, I mean, it really is. And so we've explored ways at my company, Human OS, to be able to try to facilitate deeper sleep. So some ways to do that is, maintain a regular amount of physical activity. That is one of the key factors that helps you get good sleep.
Is that just mechanistically because of the accumulation of adenosine?
Yeah. So, I mean, and if you think about it, obviously you're using a lot of energy in the body, but during physical activity, you have an increased blood flow to the brain, and you're also using your brain a lot, whatever activity you're doing, even if it demonstrably seems like a physical activity. You're using your brain as you're thinking, as you're sending neural impulses down to the muscles. And so it's not necessarily the muscular ATP that is converting into a brain signal, but it's rather the brain activity that is heightened during intense or even not that intense physical activity that is a part of getting good sleep. So just getting a regular amount of physical activity is going to be a good thing for anybody. So you don't have to be like crushing it to get better sleep. In fact, if you overworkout relative to your baseline of how much you can handle at the moment, that can actually interfere with sleep. But if you're just maintaining that good regular amount within a week, that's one thing, an important thing that's going to help you get good sleep. So it's funny because you see sleep and physical activity are kind of like two different sides of a coin. On right? So like, if you get good sleep, you're more apt to be physically active the next day. And if you're physically active the next day, you're more likely to get good sleep. So that's what we call a virtuous cycle versus that vicious cycle I was mentioning earlier.
As far as training at night, can you talk a little bit how that's going to implicate into your ability to get deep sleep? Because I know a lot of listeners are, kind of constricted to having to train after work.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you've got like physical activity is super important. Some people's only window of opportunity is to go to the gym after they've taken care of a lot of their responsibilities of the day. Now, a lot of this question depends upon how close you are to going to bed. So if you're working out immediately before going to bed and you're doing intense exercise, there is speculation that because you're releasing a lot of catecholamines that are necessary for performing high intensity activity, that may interfere with the depth of sleep that your body would otherwise want to get. So you have essentially a good thing happening, energy usage, with a bad thing occurring, stimulation of really wake promoting catecholamines that then could potentially lead to an alteration of sleep architecture. Whether or not that has a substantial impact on your next day performance, we don't totally know, because maybe your sleep architecture just adjusts slightly so that you end up getting more slow wave sleep in the middle of the night. But I think ideally you would try you wouldn't be doing anything really intense within like 3 hours of going to bed.
Right. So the big thing I want the audience to get out of this, Dan, is like understanding the value of deep sleep and some very particular applicable ways to start, one, preventing things that are getting in our way of deep sleep, and then maybe doing some things to actually increase deep sleep. Because I know I have a lot of clients who, we do all the basic things, we do the blocking of the blue light, we do the limitation of food before bed, we'll do some brain stimulating activity before bed, and still their deep sleep is relatively limited. So I'm curious, to understand the mechanism of deep sleep so that we can start to impact it in some way.
Yeah. So there are some very basic and yet extraordinarily important aspects of lifestyle that then lead to the amount of slow wave sleep that you get. They're less sexy than things like auditory stimuli or transcranial direct current stimulation, things that are coming online, which I'll talk about in a moment, that can improve the amount of time spent in slow wave sleep and even possibly the depth of slow wave sleep that you get. But a lot of these things might perfectly be addressed if you're doing everything right. So you might be trying your hardest to get good slow wave sleep by doing a lot of things right, but you might still be missing one aspect to the puzzle. And so one really important thing is affecting your exposure to light across the day. It's key. I am regularly reminded of how important it is when I slip, because it's easy to slip in our modern society, and then to tighten things back up, do things right, and then think, oh, okay, I recognize clearly how much of an impact that light is having on the successful functioning of our body. So, getting obviously enough, there's two components to it. I talk about maintaining smart daily light rhythms. And really what you're trying to do is emulate what is happening outside, both tone and intensity of light, in your indoor spaces where most of us are spending most of our time. And so I recently gave a TED talk on how to optimize light for your health. And what I did is I covered essentially all the different ways that light has an influence on our health. So from affecting hormone regulation like vitamin D, to affecting brain performance and memory performance, to even, if you can believe it, Ben, affecting the regulation of fat tissue directly. So this is sort of a little side step here, but it's so important. It's so interesting, I'll mention it. I interviewed a guy, Peter Light, last year, who runs the Light Lab in Alberta, Canada. He serendipitously discovered that fat tissue contains light receptors, the same exact light receptors that are in our eyes, which are called opsin cells. And he wasn't looking for them there. He just did a broad screen to see where they might be in the body, found them there, thought it was an artifact, tested it, realized that these receptors actually respond to an adequate intensity signal. So it's got to be something as powerful as the sun. It's not going to be like, let's say, light from a room, most likely. But what ends up happening is when you shine sunlight on your skin, about 1% of it will penetrate your skin and affect the light receptors. And it causes those fat cells that these receptors are on to shrink, to become less inflamed, and to store less fat. And he speculated that they might have just stumbled across a mechanism designed to increase fat storage during winter months, which is so interesting. Wow. I know, given that we basically spend all of our time indoors and are always fully clothed.
Totally, wearing clothes all the time.
Yeah. Is a reason why certain populations that are in a sunnier climate maintain leanness better than more, northern latitude areas. Very possible.
Right. And there's other mechanisms there too, right? Is like, increasing vitamin D, possibly improving insulin sensitivity, like all those things, positive benefits from the sun, all just lead down this path of how you can improve body composition just by being outside.
Yeah.
As well as improving sleep.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. So better blood pressure regulation. So there's a lot of things, there's a lot of value to sunlight during the day. One of those also is giving your brain a very strong signal that indeed it is daytime. And so if you step outside from a well-lit room and you go outside on a brightly lit day, full sunshine, you're going to be experiencing an order of magnitude or more, 2 orders of magnitude greater intensity of light coming into the eye. And that ends up being really important for letting your body know, okay, it is daytime, do daytime activities, which then ends up corresponding with deeper sleep at night later that day. So I try to get outside for at least 10 minutes every morning, just have a cup of coffee outside, go for a walk, whatever it is, getting a little bit of sunlight early in the morning, not right away. You don't have to get it right away, but wake up, do your thing, get outside, try to get 10 minutes before you actually step into work, or at least 10 minutes before noon. And overall, a half an hour outside every day, and you're going to get a Pareto principle there. So you're going to get most of the benefit from that little bit of effort, thankfully.
Are you getting outside? Yeah, you're getting outside just on your face, or are you getting it on your chest, or what's your process there? Is it, facing the sun, like taking it in, or is there any just like be out there?
I think just being out there. So a lot of our what are called intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells, which are blue light. These are cells that respond specifically to the tone of blue light, are disproportionately located on the bottom half of the retina. They're perfectly designed for you to be walking down the street and sunlight coming from above to then tell your eye that, okay, I'm outside and it's day. So, it's the adaptation to our environment is exquisitely tight. And so just being outside, walking around, you don't have to necessarily be facing the sun, but getting outside is good enough. Now I know that's harder for people that are at northern latitudes where the weather's terrible, it's dark a lot, and you can then get light boxes. And now you can also do with LEDs, you can have them represent different spectrum of light. So it can be full spectrum white light. And that actually is shown to have a difference depending on, compared to just like normal incandescent bulbs, which tend to run warmer and more like a sunset tone. So, with more powerful technology, there's good and bad, because you can now get a better light signal during the day, but you're also, without adjusting it, you're more apt to get the wrong type of signal, more blue light before bed. So you have to be mindful of it, and you have to figure out a way to sort of say, okay, what's the light like outside now? How can I have my indoor space reflect that? So intensity and light tone matters.
As far as mechanism of impacting deep sleep, is there anything else we know of? Maybe it's supplementally, or maybe it's environmentally, that can allow us to positively impact our not only I guess the amount of time we spend in deep sleep.
Yeah. So there's a couple of other techniques that have been explored. Auditory stimulation is one. Playing
like a binaural beats type thing.
Yeah, so that's one idea. Playing pink noise. Pink noise has been most investigated. Pink noise is like white noise, but it's more balanced across the frequency spectrum than white noise is. Having that on in the background while you sleep has been shown to aid in memory formation and depth of slow wave sleep, both in young and in older. So it's been tested 2 times.
So no negative implications as far as constantly having that stimulus in your brain. Like you just would imagine your brain firing off all these neurons and not ever being able to actually go through this, purging of the neurotoxins and getting rid of, the accumulative stress from the day.
Yeah. So it's a great question, because the really challenging thing about sleep is that it's not one state. You're going through multiple states across the night. So if you do anything and this is why sleep supplementation is so hard, because if you're trying to promote one type of sleep, you might do that, but at the expense of another, the other being important for other processes. And so I'm more favorable towards sleep supplementation that doesn't try to affect neurotransmission directly, but rather tries to create a better sleep environment, like, melatonin at a small dose that tries to sort of extend the darkness window, because melatonin really is a darkness signal and has a very light effect on our sleep, meaning it's not a strong soporific agent, but it creates the better environment for the sleep processes to kick in. Whether there are other compounds that might aid in the benefit of better sleep environment in the evening, I think more investigation needs to be given there. Are there some things, for example, that can accumulate like sleep pressure? This homeostat for sleep pressure, there's probably multiple inputs, Ben, not just energy usage, but even inputs from things like brown fat, oxidative redox signaling. There's multiple things that are taking place that can then say to the brain, it's time for sleep, get good and deep sleep, and stay sleep long without a lot of arousals. But those, we're still looking into those. And there are now mechanisms or devices that are being looked at that are trying to pulse the slow wave or the pink noise so that it's occurring only at the right time and not during, let's say, REM sleep, because that then might be disruptive to other stages. Things like rocking. If you think about, I just mentioned I have a new baby boy, right? And so what's one thing that can put them to sleep is rocking. Well, that's actually been shown to improve slow wave sleep. Now, maybe you put yourself in a hammock, or I don't exactly know how to apply that, honestly, but it works.
Mom.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Interesting, man. So I also hear conflicting data around melatonin's benefit, right? I hear people saying like, it's not something you want to be taking on a regular basis. There's certainly potentially negative implications. And I don't know if you're an expert on that, but do you have any opinion to speak to?
Yeah. So I think that most of the research in melatonin I've seen is positive. Now, most people, unless you have calcification of your pineal gland, which can occur as you get older, there might be a stronger reason for supplementing with melatonin as we age. And that would then help to enhance circadian rhythmicity, which is really the orchestration of timing of all of our processes in our body, more than just sleep. Sleep is one circadian rhythm. But imagine as you age, if that major zeitgeber or time giver of circadian timing, like melatonin, basically what melatonin is doing is it's translating the visual input of darkness into a hormonal messenger that then says it's dark. That's what this melatonin is doing, and it does so throughout the body. It tells your beta cells of your insulin, of your pancreas, to produce less insulin, which is super smart, because then that means that your body is keeping blood glucose levels in an adequate range across the night, versus storing it all. If you stored it all, then you'd be hypoglycemic, and that would wake you up. So that's one effect of melatonin. But if we think about it, we experience a very strange light signature in our day. I just mentioned some of the benefits of getting sunshine, and so we're spending 90% of our time indoors. So not only are we getting less sunshine, but we're also getting longer windows of light within a 24-hour period, and correspondingly less darkness. Is there therapeutic benefit for taking melatonin an hour before bed, perhaps to extend your quote-unquote darkness window? Maybe. What a lot of people do now is they wear amber-toned glasses that filter blue light being the predominant signal, by far, to allow for melatonin synthesis to take place. Melatonin synthesis and release is inhibited in the presence of light coming into the eye. And so if you're blocking if you're creating what's called virtual darkness or circadian darkness, which means you put on the glasses, you can see fine, so your visual system works, but you're not telling your brain that it's day, then you start to produce more melatonin, and then that leads to you feeling sleepier and getting longer sleep and also having a more aligned circadian rhythm. So yeah, smart.
There was something you said in there that I didn't even know was a thing, was calcification of the pineal gland. And again, I don't know if that's an area of expertise for you, but the fact that you mentioned it, I'd love for you to tell me what that is and what the implications of that are, because I didn't even know that was a thing.
Yeah, I'm not an expert in that. It can occur in people as they age, and the result would be a reduction in hormones that are released from the pineal gland, including melatonin. And so, melatonin is usually produced through this multisynaptic loop, and which under something called dim light melatonin onset. As I just mentioned, as the light dims in intensity, then that serves to cause a signal in the pineal gland to start producing more melatonin. Now, if that gland calcifies, the ability for it to produce and release melatonin is going to be diminished. That might then lead to a rationale for all older people taking melatonin in a physiologic range. So this is something closer to a physiologic range, which would be 300 micrograms. A lot of people take 1 milligram or 3 milligrams or 5. Microgram would be a third of a milligram. And you can find that dosing around the internets. There are companies that sell 300 micrograms. So I think I would recommend something closer to that amount for regular daytime, for regular usage if you're going to be taking it. But we could eventually arrive at a time where taking melatonin nightly is equivalent to people taking vitamin D during the day. It's just trying to help counteract the fact that we're just getting a weird light exposure, and as a result of it, we're getting, alterations in the hormones that our bodies need to function well.
As far as processes going on during the deep sleep phase, is it primarily just consolidation of memories and this kind of purging of the neurotoxins, or is there more things that are actually happening during that phase?
Yeah, so you're also experiencing a change in oxidative reductive signaling. So if you think about what that is it's the amount of free radicals and oxidants within the cytosol. That actually is one signal that is feeding into this sleep homeostat. Think of this sleep homeostat as like a concept, this pressure for sleep. That's the best way to think of it. And that pressure for sleep rises over the day. There's, again, probably multiple inputs. One of them is energy usage, and one byproduct of energy usage is more oxidative signals within the cell. And your ability to reduce those signals is important. And so if you have reductive capabilities, then that can then lead to problems with damage around the cell, particularly around the mitochondria. So you end up getting more DNA damage, mitochondrial DNA damage, which then leads to mitochondrial mutations, which then leads to your body being less able to produce energy over time. The consequences of that immediately, if you ever wake up from a bad night's sleep and you feel, less restored than you do during a good night's sleep, then that is the physical manifestation of, part of that occurring. So that is another process that is then taking place. That low energy usage seems to be, during slow wave sleep, seems to be permissive for a lot of these healing restorative processes to occur. So that's why we not only want to get a lot of slow wave sleep, but we also want to get adequate sleep duration.
I'll run with the question around coming back to these benzodiazepine compounds and, waking up from, or I guess walking down the entire path of what exact sleep states are they allowing you to enter, and which ones are they preventing? And talking a little bit about that drowsy feeling that exists when you wake up. Like, is that a result of the mitochondrial damage and potentially decreasing of the redox potential while you sleep? I'm just curious about mechanistically what's happening there and why usually you feel like you're hungover when you wake up.
Yeah. So as I mentioned a few moments ago, sleep is a very complex process. Wake, in a way, being awake is less complex. In wakefulness, you have, as I mentioned earlier, you have a variety of different different systems around the brain that form a network that are then trying to keep you awake and keep your cortex aroused and functioning. During sleep, you've got these distinct states. So you've got your non-REM, and non-REM goes from stage 1, 2, and then into slow wave sleep. Slow wave sleep is what we've been talking about with deep sleep, and that is essentially the deepest sleep that we enter into across the night. And then you go into REM sleep, and REM sleep, if you were to look at brainwave activity during REM sleep, it looks a lot like a brain that is awake. You have very high frequency scribbles across a page if you're measuring encephalographic activity or brain activity. And if you think about it, a lot of dreaming takes place during REM. And so the brain is very, very active. And it is during that process of REM so there's actually, if you're forming memories, there is a part of memory formation that is really important during slow wave sleep and also during REM sleep. So you have then the transfer of memories that have been stored in your day in the hippocampus into cortical networks that then causes long-term potentiation or long-term memory formation. And so you don't want to store your hippocampus, which is a seahorse-shaped anatomical structure within the brain, is really a way station for memories that are coming in during your wake period. But you don't want to keep them there because you're not going to try to form every single memory or keep all your memories in one little spot. You're going to distribute those around the cortex. And that's what the sleep processing does. And it does it by causing something called neural replay. Your brain will play over and over and over again these different memories that are essentially occurred during the day. And they can be very strange. And a good example of this is when was highlighted by some work done by Matt Walker and Bob Stickgold at Harvard. When Matt Walker was at Harvard, he's now runs a 20-something person lab at Berkeley. But what they did is they had people play video games before bed, and it was a downhill skiing game. And these people were going, imagine you're doing downhill skiing and you're having to go around those flags like you're in a race. Well, the first time, so they had people play that game before bed, and then they woke them up during their first REM period, and they had them recall, okay, well, now that you're awake, what were you dreaming of? Because if you wake somebody up right out of REM, they have a really good chance of remembering their dream. That's what dream remembrance is about, when you wake up. And so then the next people woke up and they said, I was dreaming I was going downhill racing. The next time they woke them up in the next REM cycle, and we have about 5 REM cycles across the night, they were dreaming about something that was a little bit more abstract. They were walking through a forest and they were having to go around trees. And then the next time they woke them up, they were in the middle of New York City and they were on a busy street having to walk around people. And so the dream became more and more abstract. But essentially what they found is that what the brain was trying to do is decipher what's important for me to remember, what should I no longer hold on to. And that's why you hear the idea that a good memory is one that also forgets. You don't want to retain every single bit of information, because then you are, people that have an eidetic memory, it sounds amazing. Like you can just remember everything that you've ever come across, but you then have a hard time filtering for importance. And so it's a bit of a burden too. And so during this process, you're actively pruning memories to get rid of them, and you're actively strengthening certain memories that the brain thinks is important. And so that is, you really want to go into these different stages of sleep, and there's a very elegant process that is taking place. Some of it is allowed with the depth of slow wave sleep. Some of it is allowed with healthy REM sleep. And yet at the same time, you can still miss sleep and still remember stuff. It's not like, while we think that the sleep is really important for strengthening memory, it's also not necessary in order to remember something. It's improved with good sleep.
It sounds like there's some pretty awesome scientific rabbit holes to dive down there as far as influencing and impacting ways to, prune these memories. Like there's got to be somebody researching this, like to use your term, the pruning process. I mean, that sounds very, very fascinating.
Yeah, there's quite a few people that are looking at this, and it's very challenging actually, because you have a bunch of one of the reasons it's so challenging is you have a bunch of interacting loops, neural loops that go from the brainstem to the thalamus and into the cortex. And to figure all that out, it's almost like you're trying to figure out traffic in New York City, but you're not even sure like where to look at. And so do it over time. People like John Peever at the University of Toronto, Marcos Frank at Washington State, and others, Matt Walker, of course, they've been really trying to figure out what is the neuroanatomy of and the neurophysiology of REM sleep and memory formation. And I'll tell you, I mean, these guys are they're really on top of the stuff, and it's hard. It's very, very hard.
Yeah, I bet. I mean, like you're effectively diving into the abyss, right? You're like trying to track things that are completely unpredictable and probably don't have much of a pattern, I would presume.
You know, they do. There is a pattern there. And actually, we've now come to the point where I think we understand REM, well, certainly better than ever before.
Wow.
But yeah, which is great. A lot of it's been done in animal models. Going into the neuroanatomy of it is just spitting out a bunch of big words. But, you know, you have areas that are, you know, there's one critical area in the nucleus pontine oralis, and that will then stimulate supramammillary nucleus, which is also in the brainstem. And then this causes what happens when you're in REM sleep? Well, one thing that happens is that you become paralyzed, right? So having muscular paralysis is a good thing, because you don't want to act out your dreams. If you did, you could put yourself in danger, because you might be defending an attacker or jumping off a cliff or something crazy, and you could then hurt yourself. So muscular paralysis during REM sleep is a good thing. And in fact, if you end up not being able to inhibit muscle activity, you end up with something called REM sleep behavior disorder. And it is thought that this disorder is prodromal, or occurs about 10 years prior to the development of Parkinson's disease. So people that have REM sleep behavior disorder, a very high percentage of them end up going on to develop Parkinson's disease. So yeah, so anyway, you know, the whole brain is working in some very unique, weird pattern, and that pattern changes across the night, but it is really healthy for us. So, you know, that's why, again, if you take some supplement or drug that affects neurotransmission and is really trying to drive slow wave sleep or something, you might be then doing so at the expense of another important sleep stage. And it's not like, even though you get more REM towards the end of the night and more slow wave sleep in the beginning, the reality is that your brain is kind of going through a unique process night by night. And I just think any sort of long-term usage of any hypnotic, even though Xyrem or sodium oxybate is awesome, you know, I wouldn't recommend it for everybody to take all the time.
Is there some way you could define this ideal scenario of sleep? Is there particular ratios, particular durations that are desirable and achievable?
Yeah. So everybody might have their own amount of slow wave sleep that they, you know, or amount of stages that they should get. But, you know, typically with REM, with slow wave sleep, you're getting about 10 to 15% of your nighttime sleep should be spent in that stage. With REM, it's somewhere between 15 to 20%. And then you're spending a lot of time in lighter stages of sleep. Now, those stages have sometimes been described as non-important, and that's not true. So even you have arousals over the course of the night. So you'll wake up 15 to 20 times, and they're called microarousals, where you might turn over in bed or you just sort of change positions. Those actually might be important too. It's not like we want to try to get rid of them. If you are waking up too much, like people that have obstructive sleep apnea, they can wake up 60 to 100 times an hour. That's not good. That is called sleep fragmentation. But having these little small arousals during the night is actually a part of the sleep process. And so it's sort of laughable at times when I hear people talk about, we want to try to reduce your sleep efficiency or increase your sleep efficiency to 100%. That statement is reflective of a non-understanding of what the sleep cycle does. You know, it's typical that you might sleep, maybe, be asleep for 85% of the time that you're in bed. You know, so for Human OS, what we do is we track sleep period instead of sleep time, because sleep period is what you can, that's what you can focus on, right? So Ben, if you were to like report your sleep to me, you'd be like, oh, I went to bed at midnight, I woke up at 8, right? That's cool. That's how you would report sleep. What you don't do is report sleep like a clinical polysomnographer or sleep study would do. That's like, okay, yeah, you went to bed at midnight, you woke up at 8, you had 85% sleep efficiency, therefore you slept 6 hours and 42 minutes, right? That's what a sleep study will tell you, but that's not how you experience sleep, right? So yes, you have your awakenings, you might be up for an hour at night, but that process is not pathological. It's part of the regular sleep process. Yes, you can be outside of the ranges, so you end up being awake too much. But being awake a little bit it's not a problem. That's part of the normal sleep process.
Is there any detriment to sleeping in maybe deep sleep or REM sleep too much?
That's a really interesting question, because if you look at mortality rates and sleep time, you see it's a U-shaped curve. So people that sleep, and actually this is looking at population. So I'll say when you look at the numbers of people that tend to sleep less than 6 hours per night, you see a higher rate of premature mortality. And that number continues to decline until around somewhere between 7 and 7.5 hours of sleep time. So, or 6 hours and 45 minutes to maybe 7.5 hours of actual sleep time. Because then you have to go back to what I was just saying. Are you reporting on sleep period, which is I went to bed, I slept for 8 hours because I went to bed at midnight, woke up at 8, or are you actually reporting on actual sleep time, which is the amount of sleep that you got in that period? But so that's caused a little bit of confusion in the literature. So anyway, if you're sleeping somewhere between, let's say, 6.5 to 7.5 hours of actual sleep, then you're great. Now, if you start to sleep more than that, you might just be one of those people who naturally sleeps more. And if you've always slept more, then I wouldn't really worry. However, remember I was saying that premature mortality rates follow a U-shaped curve. So the less you sleep, they're high, then they descend. So you have less of a chance of premature mortality down into this range, and then they start to go up again. Your risk for dying early increases the farther you start to get away from that sleep time of between 6.5 to 7.5 hours. Why? Well, one, you can't translate that into people that sleep long automatically have a problem, because the amount of sleep that you get is dependent on the amount of physical activity that you're doing. If you're doing really high intensity training, your body needs more rest, and the amount of sleep that you get will be in response to that. But all of a sudden, if you generally have been sleeping 7 hours your whole life, and all of a sudden you're now sleeping 9, that could be reflective of some sort of high inflammatory burden. Now think about how you feel when you get the flu, right? You get sleepy and heavy, and all you want to do is sleep all day. So the immune system has a bidirectional effect on our sleep. It's one of those other things that can contribute to the sleep homeostat. If you have high inflammation, that can make you want to sleep more and be sleepier during the day. So it reduces your vigilance or alertness during the day, and it can make you sleep longer. Now, if you're constantly in that state, you might have an infection. It might be reflective of some other sort of inflammatory burden that's happening. But you can't necessarily look at somebody that says, oh, I'm sleeping 9 hours, and say that's bad. You have to dig deeper. But it is a cause to dig deeper.
How do you feel about these tracking apps and techs that exist, as far as their, first of all, accuracy, and second of all, benefit in people actually having some metrics on their sleep quality?
Yeah, so I have a strong opinion on this, and that really the first phase of these devices, they're basically behavior modifiers. So tracking your sleep does not make your sleep better. What it can do, one, is it can help you form a goal for what time you want to go to bed. It can make you more conscious about your sleep, right? Oh, okay. I noticed that I feel better if I go to bed at this time and I wake up at this time. So one thing that you can do is plan for complete sleep, meaning, all right, I'm going to go to bed and wake up naturally versus to an alarm. That can be a good thing, because you're giving yourself an adequate amount of time. So Ben, if you had a really hard workout and your body wants to sleep a little bit longer tomorrow because that's what it needs, then allow it to do so, right? If you cut yourself off, then you might not be getting, all the sleep that your body wants. And that's okay on a occasional basis, but generally, are you getting, complete sleep? That's what you want. So what I do is I've been tracking my sleep for years, right? And I know the stuff. I explore it. I do it as a way to modify my behavior. So I want to go to bed by 10:30 every night. And so I track my sleep duration and my sleep timing. Timing is going to be affected by, when I go to bed, and then so is duration. And in fact, I've been learning some interesting things about my sleep by recording it. I noticed that if I go to bed at 9, which sounds preposterously early, I can naturally fall asleep at that time, and I will sleep until the same amount of time. I'll sleep until 6:30. I cannot sleep past 6:30. I wake up. And that's been interesting to me. And I've been getting better sleep, I think, by going to bed early, which I'm now drawing an analogy to like palatable food like ice cream, that we could probably all go to bed earlier than we do, but it is that extra time that usually is reserved for our personal time, spending time with our, family, watching TV, doing whatever, relaxing, doing whatever the fuck you want, but it's your time. And to miss out on that, quote unquote, by going to bed earlier, you sort of need to very consciously recognize the benefits of doing so. And that will then motivate you to sort of skip out on that extra personal time. But that is the warfare that's taking place in the evening, which is to say, okay, how do I want to feel tomorrow versus do I want a little of that extra time tonight? And I've been going to bed earlier now because I would rather have a shorter day that's more productive and more, me accomplishing more and feeling better than kind of getting a little bit extra in later. And I know it's not easy. I'll tell you that. It's not always easy to do that.
And I do the same, and I find my sleep quality is massively improved. If I'm typically in bed by 9 o'clock, and I try to sleep by 10. So, depending what's going on, or if I'm reading or what. But even if I'm up at 4:30, I still feel amazing. Rather than going to bed at 10:30 and waking up at 6, it's not the same for me. So, I know everyone kind of laughs that, hey man, you're in bed by 9 o'clock, but yeah, you just adjust your life that way, and you go to have dinner a little bit earlier, and you just make those adjustments. And I feel like it's just way more productive, way better sleep. My deep sleep is tracking much higher using Oura Ring. Deep sleep is better, REM sleep is better, and it's so much more consistent. And talking about one thing that I did that I actually noticed a pretty dramatic increase in my deep sleep, at least as far as measuring it with the Oura Ring, was adding some, like you said, sunlight in the morning or a little bit of red light exposure at some time throughout the day. Actually dramatically increased my deep sleep, almost twofold. That's at certain points. So I was pretty impressed by seeing that.
Very interesting. Yeah. So to circle back to the question about tracking, you've got there's the Oura Ring, there's Fitbit, there's Garmin. There's a lot of them that are detecting sleep from the wrist, and they do so by they're triangulating multiple signals, probably heart rate, sometimes temperature, movement. And what they're doing is they're trying to take the signals that they can collect, then map those to algorithms that are validated from things called actigraphy, or actimetry, that's looking at movement at night. And then, the more signals that you have and the higher quality those signals are, the more you're able to then create an algorithm that is predictive of actually what's happening during sleep. So David Sampson, who's a professor at Toronto, and I have a grant that has been awarded a grant to look at hunter-gatherers, because if you have ever done a sleep study, it's sort of ridiculous. You're hooked up to 27 different leads, and you look like Predator coming out of your head at night. There's all these wires. Yeah. You have, sometimes they do one called a PEZ, which they put a wire down your throat to try to measure breathing.
And then go to sleep and have some great deep sleep.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So, So the sophistication of the method of polysomnography is not designed to test natural sleep. It's really looking to identify pathognomonic characteristic features of certain sleep disorders. That's why you do it, right? Does this person have sleep apnea? Does this person have restless leg, REM sleep behavior disorder, narcolepsy, whatever? And that's why you do those types of studies. But what we can't do very well is measure sleep accurately without disrupting it. It's that sort of Heisenberg principle, right? And so we now, with things like Oura Ring, et cetera, and I think that Oura Ring is going to have really a positional advantage to the other devices because a ring can form a snug fit around your finger. And because they're looking at things like heart rate from arterial sources on the bottom side of the finger, I think they have the chance to detect sleep most accurately. Now, as you've said, you've noticed that when you do certain things, the feedback you get in terms of the amount of slow wave sleep has changed. Therefore, you're now going to populate your day with more sunlight in the morning, more red light. That's one of the benefits, is when then you can start to identify things that actually relate to more slow wave sleep, better sleep consistency, longer sleep durations, and hopefully how you feel the next day. That, I think, is a great advancement in quantified self-tracking. Then the next stage of devices for sleep really are going to be, I mean, of course, we have the environmental factors, so things that might affect lighting. That's cool. And then also things that might intervene in sleep, as we were alluding to earlier, like a headband from the company Dream that is measuring your brainwave activity through this headband over the night and then playing sounds, this pink noise, at the right stage during slow wave sleep to amplify it so that you spend more time in slow wave sleep. Those companies have raised over $50 million. This one company, Dream, has. There's going to be more companies like it. Philips has a device as well. And that could be the future, because you see 3-time memory enhancement for people that get more slow wave sleep with the usage of these headbands. And you possibly will see the purging of those neurotoxic substances. Could these sorts of devices rescue your, let's say you have no longer have the chance of getting slow wave sleep, but now with these devices, they can actually promote that, and then that might help to fix the situation. It's possible, and that's pretty exciting.
Wow. And is it relative, from your experience, is it relatively accurate, the Dream headband, in actually measuring your brain states?
So I have not actually been able to experience it personally. I've not bought a device and used it. I believe they've got very good people working on it. Emmanuel Mignot, who runs the Narcolepsy Treatment Center at Stanford, discoverer of a lot of important things in sleep. So he's excellent. And they've got some other, they're mostly out of France. Philips has been dedicated to sleep and light for a while. And so they've got good people as well. I think that there is a real chance for a device like this to promote some meaningful change in people's sleep over the lifespan. However, we know that we can draw an analogy to CPAP, continuous positive airway pressure, for people that have sleep apnea. These are devices that you have to wear over the night. You wear it as a mask. This positive airway pressure helps people that can't breathe very well during sleep breathe better and therefore sleep better, and therefore feel better the next day. Compliance rates, however, are terrible. People don't want to wear, stuff on their body when they're sleeping. It feels disruptive and annoying, even when you can prove that it's not. So, I think for people that have high risk of Alzheimer's disease, the fear of that versus the annoyance of, wearing a band at night might be better adopted, I should say. But and then you've got, of course, the biohackers that are looking for an advantage and are trying, they'll tolerate it. But unless that advantage is perceptible, then you're probably not going to continue to use something. And perception can be really hard, because you could be experiencing a 15% improvement in memory. But if that might be hard for you to perceive, because we acclimate to our new standards so quickly. And that works two ways, right? A decrement in performance and an improvement in performance. So you have to be really in touch with yourself to know if it's like having an effect that you want to maintain.
That's what I was going to say. Most people just aren't paying attention that well and wouldn't have any idea whether their performance is being increased. So I'm glad you brought up the CPAP, because I actually have quite a few number of clients that actually use that. And I was very curious, is that the type of thing where it's ultimately, obviously improving their sleep acutely? Is that something we ultimately want to get them off and in some way improve their breathing while they sleep? Or is it something that most people are going to be on for life?
Yeah, it depends on the type of sleep apnea that you have and the severity. there's central sleep apnea, which is called Ondine syndrome, and that is much more rare. But what you end up having in that instance is in the medullary region of the brain, the medulla, it's not generating the signal for breathing until you become so hypoxic that you end up having this alerting response from catecholamines. So that's rare. But it does exist. Most people have what's called obstructive sleep apnea, and that means that their airway, because the soft palate relaxes during sleep, it actually interferes with breathing. And so people that snore a lot have trouble with CPAP. I mean, if you're a snorer, your bed partner is, going and getting a sleep study done is a good idea. And then, unfortunately, as you know, Ben, we have a really awful epidemic of overweight and obesity in our world. Yeah. And that is probably the most causative factor of sleep apnea for most people. Now, sadly, it's another one of those vicious cycles. So the more that you gain weight, the worse you sleep. The worse you sleep, the more likely you are to be more insulin insensitive and to also gain weight for multiple reasons. So losing weight is a really good thing to get people off of that. There's also surgical techniques, lasering the soft palate so that it's tighter. So even if it relaxes, it's going to not interfere with breathing. And then now they're even looking at CBD oil as something that can have a actual positive effect on breathing during sleep. And actually the results have been pretty positive. But I do have concerns because although there's a lot of interest and enthusiasm in different cannabinoids and their effects on our physiology, I do think that there are legitimate therapeutic uses, particularly for people that have high degrees of inflammation. But it's also been shown pretty clearly, sadly, that it can interfere with memory processing and it will interfere with mitochondria health. And pretty much everything, in my opinion, that is good for your health is good for your mitochondria, not bad for them. So
you've seen research that says CBD just in general is negatively impacting mitochondrial health?
Yeah. Oh, wow. I know. Now, can that be counteracted by having high factors that are stimulating mitochondrial biogenesis and health? Perhaps. So that's a question that's unknown. Can you take CBD if you are otherwise doing a lot of good things in your life, having a lot of plant phytochemicals, doing occasional fasting, exercise? Might those negative effects be counteracted to a net effect of not being, negative? So you get the positives, but you don't get the negatives. I don't know that.
Very interesting. Have you seen any studies around sleep and CBD? Obviously, it's going to decrease inflammation, so potentially it could be helping sleep, but any direct mechanisms?
Well, yeah. So now the sleep and the CBD connection is interesting. And the results, there's a meta-analysis that's looked at cannabinoids to see if they have a powerful effect on sleep. I think that one therapeutic usage that a lot of people, take advantage of with CBD or with THC is the sleep effects. So it makes you go to sleep and feel really, really sleepy, particularly certain strains. And for some people, I think it can be wonderful. In fact, I'm really interested in some fast-acting, inhalable, THC for middle of the night arousal. So let's say you wake up, we all have that experience where your brain is just overworking and you can't go back to sleep. Could you then, instead of taking a hypnotic, could you take some THC, relax the body, and go back to sleep faster? That's pretty interesting to me as an occasional therapeutic. You just keep it in your bedside table, you take it as needed, and hopefully you don't become reliant on it, because that psychologically can happen with anything that you take, even melatonin. What happens is your brain thinks, this is helping me and I need it, and then you develop a psychological dependence on it. So that can happen with anything. But yeah, and then remember, if CBD is influencing inflammation, we want high inflammation at the beginning of the night because it's generating slow wave sleep. And that's why things like antioxidants are not a great idea to take, probably ever, but particularly right before bed. And so in a conversation I had with Mimi Shirazo, she's at Columbia, and we talk about oxidative signaling. And so again, there's probably a bidirectional relationship there. And so if you're ever going to take antioxidants, taking them first thing in the morning is going to make your head feel very clear right away. However, again, do we want to be taking antioxidants at all? Probably not. So I would save that for, the occasional time when you're feeling groggier and you want to feel fresher, faster. The reason I should tell you why I don't think we should be taking them is because oxidative signaling is actually really important for the functioning of our cells. And so we had this idea that, taking antioxidants would be a good thing, less damage. It turns out that these reactive oxygen species, particularly in the cytosol, will then activate. They uncouple something called NRF2 from, it's usually bound up in your cytosol. And when they're oxidized by these oxidative signals, it turns into a transcription factor, goes into your DNA, and it basically stimulates all sorts of pathways, anti-cancer pathways that then improve your own antioxidant capabilities, and also even maintenance of stem cells. So you don't want really to be taking antioxidants. You want to be taking things like phytochemicals, like, glycosinolates, anthocyanidins, polyphenols, flavonoids, things like that. And those actually act like exercise. Catechins, they actually cause a little bit of stress like exercise does, and then that stimulates all these pathways, improving your oxidative status. So sorry for that purge of
No, man, that was absolutely honestly amazing and extremely helpful. I'm still curious about mechanistically though, how CBD is impacting sleep. So if we know it's decreasing inflammation, it could be potentially decreasing deep sleep. So is it just more like the relaxation effect that gets people to be able to calm down and get into sleep, but we don't know enough about whether it's impacting deep sleep versus REM sleep positively or negatively?
Yeah, I don't actually know. I need to revisit that subject. The meta-analysis that I remember seeing showed a positive effect in 2 studies, so improvements in sleep, and a non-effect in the other 2 studies tested. That was 4. There's, of course, anecdotal reports that say this is the best sleep I've ever gotten, and I've experienced that. And I, really haven't been a fan of cannabis personally throughout my life, but because for sleep, I'm not saying that for any reason other than that just being the truth, but I have experimented with sleep. Some companies have come to me to sort of say, hey, can we come up with a product here? And I've been worried, honestly, about its effects overall on our health. I think the occasional usage of CBD is great. I think the chronic usage really should be merited by probably an existing issue where the net state is improved, but it's maybe not an ideal state. So,
are there any healthy analogs to GHB or precursors to GHB that could kind of give us a similar benefit?
Yeah, so phenibut is an interesting one. That works in a different way, but is similar. You can buy that legally now. People can take it during the day and have sort of feel slightly, I wouldn't say intoxicated, depends on the dose. They can feel really, really good. You have a clarity of mind that is noticeable. It's also addictive. So you see reports on places like Reddit of people desperate for help to get off of phenibut because they've been taking it regularly for a long time. I have not personally taken phenibut for sleep, so I can't say from a personal experience if it's actually beneficial. But again, I worry a little bit about taking substances that directly affect neurotransmission because of what we talked about earlier, how there's such distinct states. It just worries me a bit. But yeah, and then baclofen is another GABA B agonist like GHB. But honestly, GHB has such a unique effect in the brain. I mean, there are things that act on similar receptors, but GHB seems to be, I've not seen anything that is entirely comparable. And in fact, even in certain serotonin drugs, because there were several pharmaceutical companies that were looking at agents to directly improve slow wave sleep, and they found several serotonergic substances or drugs that work on serotonin system that did improve slow wave sleep significantly. And it didn't have really the next day benefits that we thought. And so there is a possibility that you are stimulating slow wave sleep artificially, and you're seeing these slow waves occur on your PSG, or that measurement of slow waves, but you're not experiencing the benefits of them that you would hope to usually expect when you see that occur. So there might be a difference if that process of slow wave sleep is driven by the processes that are occurring in the brain, and you can just observe that from outside by seeing slow waves, versus pharmacologically inducing it and then you might be not getting the same benefits at all.
I want to kind of caution the listener as far as the potential negative implications of GHB, especially what you're going to find underground street grade GHB as compared to what you would find in a sleep clinic or at Jazz Pharma like you worked. Can you just give us a little bit of insight into potentially the negative implications and potentially the downfall? I just don't want it to seem like a positive panacea of everything great for sleep and no negative implications. And I also don't want to condone people going out and using GHB, the recreational party recreational party implications.
Yeah, you got it. And I think that's so important, because there are truly a lot of things to be excited about GHB for certain clinical conditions. And what I mean by that specifically is that with narcolepsy, they have a significant improvement in the quality of life, which has been rigorously tested and demonstrated over 30 years. There are also people that have been on a nightly dosing for over 35 years that are doing great on it. But GHB has a downside. And in fact, if you look at GHB over time, there are multiple stories that have been told, from its use as a drug to facilitate sexual assault, from a drug that causes really significant withdrawal symptoms that have even led to death in some people, to its use therapeutically. Now, we can parse that out. So let's talk about the withdrawal first. Narcoleptics take sodium oxybate, which is the same thing as GHB. They take that twice a night in pretty high doses, right? You're used to thinking of a withdrawal or abuse scenario as somebody taking higher doses than what might be used clinically. With GHB, you want to basically take a high enough dose where it causes, you have to reach a certain concentration, 150 micromolar, in order for GHB to stimulate GABA B receptors. Below that, you will actually affect different neuronal systems in a way that is similar to how alcohol will have an effect on central nervous system depression. So if you think about the first stage of central nervous system depression is excitation. Think about alcohol. You take it, it doesn't make you sleepy, even though it's a depressant. It disinhibits a lot of your neurons, which then leads to excitability, sociability, right? You feel energized and right? And if you can stay in that exact state, you can basically stay alerted and excited for a long period of time. And then eventually it'll lead to hypnosis, sedation, hypnosis, and then if you kept going, coma and death. And you see people that drink alcohol, and they of course can die from that. That's not uncommon. Same with any sort of central nervous system depression, including GHB. And what happened though is that bodybuilders became aware that because GHB stimulates slow wave sleep, and during slow wave sleep is when the majority of growth hormone is released, especially in men, across a 24-hour period, that, cool, this is an incredible sleep aid, I'm going to start taking it. Then some research out of Italy came out showing that given GHB in the morning, you still saw a pulsatile increase in growth hormone, even though the subjects didn't go to sleep. And that led to people then taking GHB multiple times throughout the day, because you wanted to get that pulse of growth hormone. What happened then is that because you're not allowing your receptors to essentially rest and recover, they become desensitized. And that then leads to withdrawal. When your receptors become insensitive to GABA, then this system that is usually involved in keeping you sort of feeling grounded, now all of a sudden you're feeling anxious and like you want to scrape the paint off the walls, and it can be extremely uncomfortable. And so interestingly, GHB has been used in people with alcohol withdrawal and cocaine withdrawal, but it itself can cause withdrawal too. So you have to be really, really careful of that. And taking it twice at night in narcoleptics has not proven to lead to a kind of a withdrawal scenario for a lot of people. And yet some people had reported adverse events that said, yes, I felt terrible the next day. I felt like my skin was crawling and the drug just wasn't right for them. So that's a little bit about the withdrawal scenario. The abuse scenario is, in terms of sexual assault, is actually sort of a sad but very interesting story. And so it had been reported in the literature, one of the reasons why GHB was banned in 1990s was because, and eventually by the DEA in 2000, is because it had been reported in sexual assault. So what does that mean? That when somebody was date raped, they had GHB on board. Now, the California Poison Control System had done a study to then look at all the different chemicals. And there's over 60 different compounds that have been used in scenarios of date rape or sexual assault. So what does that mean? These are mostly things that sedate you. So the things that were highest in prevalence on that list are alcohol and marijuana. And in fact, the conclusion of this paper that came out said, it's not actually a healthy thing for society when drugs get the date rape moniker, because GHB accounted for less than 0.3% of total reports in their database system that was nationwide. And yet it was sort of what was getting all the fear. And yet almost 50% of the cases were from alcohol, cocaine, 50% were alcohol. And then you also saw a high amount from marijuana and cocaine. So it had a lot to do with exposure. But can GHB actually, is there something else to it? And yes, there is. I think that it has probably pretty unique properties. And this is why I think people really enjoy taking it, that lead people to feel kind of a sense of euphoria and pro-social and even pro-sexual effects that make you feel more sexual on it in the right scenario. And that work has been really, really interesting. I'm happy to tell you about that if you'd like.
I'd love to hear it. Absolutely. Now, so one thing I just want to wrap up that loop. I think it's also important for people to realize what's accessible through a sleep lab compared to what's accessible in your typical underground market is not the same thing. And even though GHB in its pharmaceutical form probably has a lot of these positive benefits, what's typically being sold on the street is not the same thing, and may have similar benefits, but chemically is going to be very different with potentially massive negative health implications. And you just didn't bring that up, so I wanted to kind of wrap that up and close that loop for us.
Thank you, Ben. And that's absolutely right. So as GHB was cracked down upon, then what happened is people would start to sell what are called congeners. And these are things like 1,4-butanediol and gamma-butyrolactone. These are things that are very close chemically to GHB, and in fact could either be converted into GHB on the stovetop through, you go through this process, you could find it on the internet and do it, or actually, even if you take them orally, they'll convert to GHB in the body. But there are a lot of problems with that. For one, even though these were mass produced for chemical processes, these congeners, they're not made under good manufacturing practices. So you don't have to essentially establish a certain degree of purity if they're going to just be used in the making of spandex, right? They can have impurities that themselves could be really bad for the human body, that you're not necessarily getting out of the compound if you synthesize it on the stove. That's one real issue. Secondly, these congeners, particularly 1,4-butanediol, that will cross the blood-brain barrier at a higher rate than GHB will itself. And so you could take a smaller dose, but it could lead to an overdose, essentially, which people have overdosed and died on it, particularly when used in combination. So if you have a little bit of alcohol on board and GHB or 1,4-butanediol, and you're now, you suppress breathing and people can die. So the risks are real. I've known a few people that have died around San Francisco that were sort of friends of friends. And in one case, a guy took an Ambien on a transcontinental flight back to the United States, got home, wasn't sleeping, and then took GHB, and then it didn't wake up. And, young, healthy, smart guy. And so, you do have to be really, really careful with that too. So yeah, thanks, Ben. That's a good point.
Man, wrapping up the conversation, I want to talk to just a little bit about sleep's implication on decision making. I know that's your half of your PhD thesis, and I think that's very fascinating, right? So we know of people having more predisposition to eating poor foods, making bad decisions when they're sleep deprived. Is that kind of, that's super interesting for people who are trying to lose weight, people who are, competitive athletes. Can you just talk about maybe mechanistically what's happening and some of the research that you've come across or you've done on your own on how exactly sleep is impacting decision making?
Yeah. So there's a lot of different processes in the brain that are affected by inadequate sleep. And the mechanisms behind it are pretty interesting. And it kind of depends on what you're talking about. But basically, I'll first start with attention, because attention and arousal really fuel just about every different cognitive processes, whether it's things that relate to executive functioning, like decision making, to other parts of executive functioning, like working memory, information processing, how fast information can get into the brain, go around from different parts of the brain, make good decisions on that. It's affected in a lot of different ways, but essentially, when you are sleep deprived, you have an unstable wake network. And if you're looking at a brain that is awake and trying to pay attention to its environment, you have a high activity of the frontoparietal network. It's funny because when we think about neuroanatomy, we tend to think of it almost like the body in that, here's my elbow. My elbow has this function. My elbow is the site of, arm flexion and extension, right? So but with the brain, we have different loci, different parts of the brain, but the function of the brain is really the connection of multiple different parts of the brain working in concert for a specific purpose. So you have, when you're thinking about attention, you have your frontoparietal network, which means that the parietal region of the brain and the frontal cortex are strongly connected. And that's fueled by a good level of arousal, which I talked about the wake network earlier. When you are not thinking, or when you're not on task, I should say, so you're not focusing on one thing, then you have the activation of something called the default mode network, or the task negative network. It's a good way to think of it, task negative, meaning that when your brain is not focused on something specific, it sort of daydreams. It goes through this autobiographical thing where, you've heard that saying before, like most of the things that you say are to yourself. And yeah, that is that autobiography that is constantly going on in the backdrop, that, just the daydreaming that takes place. When you are doing that, this default mode network, which is this collection of brain areas that includes actually the midline frontoparietal regions, that one is dominant. So the brain activity is dominant by the task negative network, the default mode network. Now, when you've gotten enough sleep, like a good night's sleep, you have very strong transitions between these two different networks. So if you're thinking about something, your frontoparietal region is focused like a laser, right? It's on, it's connecting strongly. When you're sleep deprived, you end up having intrusions of the default mode network that interfere with the activity of the frontoparietal network. And so you have lapses in thinking and lapses in focus. So it's not like you can't focus when you're sleep deprived. You just can't focus very long or very reliably. Now, when you're trying to make decisions, the decision making is interesting because it is essentially a competitive sport, if you will. Oftentimes, the decision, you're weighing different options. And sometimes those options are exclusively within sort of the analytical zone. So you're trying to then have two pieces of information that you are deciding between that are all within the frontal cortex. And so your working memory will then hold those two ideas in your mind. And if you have constant intrusion that's breaking down that frontoparietal network, it's just really hard to focus on anything and make a good decision. Secondly, you can have another scenario where you've got, let's say, something that is more hedonically driven versus something that is more driven by by like, let's say your self-control areas. So this is how this relates to food. If you, let's say, love ice cream, the regions of your brain that respond to pleasurable stimuli are going to become more active after sleep deprivation than they would under normal sleep. And the areas like the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, part of that frontoparietal network, they're going to be offline. They're not going to be as strong. And so your ability to counteract food choices that are not good for you, but you also know that you like, is weakened. And that leads to something called effort discounting. So you're less likely to make an effort towards something that you care about, like eating well so that you're trying to, for body composition purposes. That is a really interesting result of poor sleep. And the mechanisms behind it are well known now too.
And that's been the greatest download of somebody's brain when it comes to sleep that I've ever experienced, I've ever heard. So thank you. Truthfully, I don't know if on HemoOS, if you're doing courses and stuff on sleep, but it's, I would pay endless amounts of money to understand this stuff at this level. So thank you. Are you teaching that stuff on HemoOS?
Yeah. So we're going to publish several different courses on sleep with the main point to try to help people know, both see the forest from the trees, because you can get lost in the details, and there's an endless amount of details with sleep, but to then highlight and emphasize the important factors of things that are actionable so that you can get good sleep yourself. And part of that is just having a fascination in sleep, knowing its importance in your life, and then clarity about ways to things to take action on. But, one common mistake is that somebody who cares about sleep tries to focus on improving their sleep entirely during the sleep period, where a lot of things that are going to improve the type of sleep that you get are going to occur during the day. So light in the morning, types of food that you eat, etc. And also recognizing the consequences, as we were just talking about. Because a lot of these things will operate while it's a real effect. You might not recognize that it's happening. You're just making different sorts of decisions in your day, and it doesn't feel weird to you, but it's strange or weird compared to the types of decisions you would ordinarily make. And we live really in a sleep-deprived society. And so, I deal with a lot with investment bankers and VCs and even hedge funds, and go do work with them and think about the consequences if you're dealing with literally tens of millions of dollars and you're making decisions. And all those guys take personal pride in staying up late. I mean, look at Wall Street and sort of the reputation that it's had.
Yeah.
And it's, some pretty bad decisions can be made, and ones that are uncharacteristic of yourself too. That's a key thing to think about. They're uncharacteristic of who you are or who you want to be.
Now, working with those people one-on-one, what are the first 3 lines of action you're taking with somebody? Somebody comes to you today and says, Dan, I want to improve my sleep. What are the first 3 action items you're taking? Obviously, I'm going to guess light is in there because you talk so extensively about that. Are there other ones as far as just overall, I want to feel better. I want to have a greater ability to make decisions. I want to be able to perform better. What are my action items?
Yeah. Light, environment, and then the day. So get smart light rhythms day, evening, and night. Make sure that your sleeping environment is perfectly permissive to getting good sleep. So it's dark, you've got a comfortable bed, and that there's nothing disrupting your sleep during the night. And if there is, figuring out some sort of compromise or way to modify it so that you're getting good sleep. Sometimes that means sleeping in a different room than your bed partner, which can sound terrible for some people, but might be what it's required to get great sleep. And then lastly is that a lot of these things that are going to get you good sleep can occur with a good regular physical activity practice and a good diet, and high in nutrients, high in fiber, and then just getting enough physical stimulation during the day. It doesn't have to be super intense, but it has to be regular.
Man, so much great information. There's so many more questions I want to ask, but I don't want to take up any more time. So thank you so much. I'm truly grateful, and hopefully I'll be blessed enough to have you back on, and I'll definitely be diving into HemoOS. Now, is the site up and active and functioning so the listeners can jump on there?
Yeah, it's up, it's active. We have peer-reviewed health courses. So that's one thing we do with our courses. So for example, you've had Greg on the show. Greg's working on a course on sleep and athletics, how to improve athletic performance. That course is reviewed by Craig Heller, who is the chair of neuroscience at Stanford. And so, that's basically what we try to do, is we try to have a level of review. So the information that we're putting out is the highest quality. Because in our society, and Ben, you know this as well, anybody, we tend to gravitate towards novelty over necessarily like what offers greatest impact. So the thing that everybody's doing currently is the thing that's being talked about and that's exciting and new, but it might not be the thing that gets you the best results. So we're really focused on that. We're making how-to guides for a lot of different aspects of health, because of course, the interplay between, look, like nutrition and sleep, right? Exercise and sleep, vice versa. It all relates. And yet it's complicated. We're trying to then make you more knowledgeable about things that can help you, more knowledgeable about yourself, and better at putting it into practice. And that's what Human OS is all about. So, we love coming and talking to your community. I love the questions you always ask, and it's always a pleasure to chat with you, Ben.
Dan, thank you. And, I'm a fan from afar and watching what you do, and I'll pursue Human OS as much as I can, because I know you're collaborating with the brightest people in the world. So thank you for that. And our listeners, thank you for that as well.
Yeah, you got it. You have a great day now.
Thanks, man. Thanks for your time.
All right.
All right, that's a wrap, ladies and gentlemen. Hope you enjoyed the podcast with Dan Pardi. So some of my parting thoughts. I've had a lot of you guys ask for closing thoughts on these podcasts. As I mentioned briefly in there, sleep has been something that's kind of been the impossible dream for me throughout my bodybuilding career. I was a 5-hour-a-night kind of guy, and I just, said, hey, this is part of life. You just man up and do it. And I had a lot of brain fog. I had a lot of negative thoughts in my brain. It was a really hard time getting focused in the workout. A lot of times, transparently, I didn't want to train. I was so damn tired. I had to take a pre-workout to get into the gym, and you become dependent on those things. And sometimes there's going to be a negative period of having to remove those things where you feel terrible. But I highly suggest each of you guys be aware of the fact that if you need a stimulant to get up in the morning, if you need a stimulant for a workout, it's a huge problem, right? Needing anything in life is a big, big crutch. And I suggest every one of you at least consider removing it, or at least limiting your stimulants to positively impact your sleep. So some of the things I've done over the last 2 to 3 years to positively impact my sleep: one, meditation. And it sounds silly, but if you can learn to control your response to stress, you're going to be a better human being. You're going to have a better ability to sleep. 2, light exposure every day in the morning. If you live somewhere where you're not getting a tremendous amount of sunlight, get yourself a red light, or get yourself some type of high lumen light exposure during the day. Again, being outside for 15 minutes is the best ideal scenario. One thing that I've done to hack that is, if I can't get outside because of time or exposure, I'll always get myself some red light exposure. And I do it in the morning, and I don't know that it's better in the morning, but I do it in the morning right after I train. It's also beneficial before you train to improve nitric oxide in your blood, improve blood vessel dilation. Those are some things I've done very recently that I've seen a massive increase in my deep sleep. And I track it with this ring I'm wearing here called the Aura Ring. I track it every night. So I'm tracking my stages of sleep. I'm also tracking my heart rate variability, which is a podcast that I haven't done yet, but I will. And I talk a little bit about it in my 6 Pillars podcast, but definitely something I suggest if you're someone who's looking to improve sleep, or if you feel like you wake up with maybe less than optimal sleep. Starting to track your sleep is going to give you some kind of objective measures on, hey, what's actually happening here? And heart rate variability plays in huge into that. Moving along, some other things that I've done to improve sleep over my life, taking some things that are calming, or yin aminos or yin supplements, like taurine, like theanine. GABA can be something. Dan also mentions phenibut, which can be useful, but also, again, potentially addictive. And if you're not taking magnesium, absolutely consider taking magnesium. I like magnesium glycinate or magnesium threonate in the dosage between 400 and 600 milligrams at a time, 2 to 3 times a day. If you're taking the threonate, it's best before bed. It's going to be a little bit calming and sedating to you. But the biggest thing, guys, that's made the biggest difference to my sleep over the last X number of years is blocking blue light before bed, without a shadow of a doubt. If you're exposed to blue light, your sleep's going to be diminished. I see this in myself. I see this in my kids. So absolutely start paying attention. If you're not already using blue light blockers, I suggest you do it, or at the very least turn it all off, dim the lights, use some candles, something like that before bed. I hope you guys enjoyed the show. As always, don't forget to subscribe, because iTunes is doing some things right now where if you're not regularly listening to the podcast, they're going to unsubscribe you. If you want to hear the podcast on a regular basis, head over to iTunes right now and subscribe. If you get there, if you leave us a review, we're giving away prizes every single podcast now from either the MI40 Nation, which is my site teaching you guys how to build your greatest body and live your greatest life, or we're giving away from our amazing podcast sponsors. And I just want to give a shout out to our podcast sponsors, Foursigmatic, on this episode. You guys know I'm a huge fan of Foursigmatic. So the product I use from Foursigmatic is reishi. And I actually like this even if I feel like I'm getting a little run down, my immune system's run down, or if I feel like I just want to come down before bed. The reishi is absolutely awesome. I add it to a tea or just drink it on its own. They also have a reishi mixed with hot chocolate, hot cocoa, which I give to my kids. And sometimes I sneak in there myself before bed if I'm really feeling run down and need to have some great sleep. So shout out to Foursigmatic for sponsoring the podcast, taking care of me, taking care of you. You guys can use the code MUSCLE for 15% off Foursigmatic, or you can go to foursigmatic.com/muscle and experience that same discount there. Hope you guys have had an amazing day and enjoyed the podcast. I appreciate you all. Take care.
Join us on benpakulski.com to learn the cutting-edge techniques to take control of your body, your brain, and create your greatest life.
This podcast is for information purposes only. The statements and views on this podcast are not medical advice. This podcast, including Ben Pakulski and the producers, disclaim responsibility for any possible adverse effects from the use of information contained herein. Opinions of guests are their own, and this podcast does not endorse or accept responsibility for statements made by guests. This podcast does not make any representations or warranties about guest qualifications or credibility. This podcast may contain paid endorsements or advertisements for products or services. Individuals on this podcast may have a direct or indirect financial interest in products or services referred to herein. If you think you have a medical problem, consult a licensed physician.